happy. Another major reason is America's religious and England and Australia are not. I wonder if when England was more religious, such as in the 19th century, whether it was more positive. But even then it wasn't as positive as America. Perhaps it's the American dream of the frontier, that you can always go west and reinvent yourself. Perhaps optimism goes with being number one. I don't think Jews tend to be as optimistic about life as Christians, but on the other hand, Christians think this is a fallen world, so maybe it's easy to be optimistic when there are 2 billion of you as opposed to 14 million. So Pastor Dibley in this movie says he's looked all his life for an adequate definition of love, because that's something Christians are into. Love, love, love. There's a lot of talk and a lot of defining of love. Pastor finally says love is fullness of response. Got that out of Reader's Digest. So after Jenny and her family took out a restraining order against Ken, he calls her up and asks her to come over, and she says, well, you left a pair of socks behind. So women are great about practical stuff like that. You only want to root them, but they often have to have a pretext to come over. Perhaps they bought a sack of potatoes on sale and they want to give them to you. That's what happened to me once, and I got this glorious shag from my ex-girlfriend of 5 years past. Afterwards she said, how many girls you been with since me? And I said, about 10. How many guys have you been with since me? And she said, 1. And she said, about those 10 girls, they taught you well, you used to be so awkward. So our protagonist goes back to a Seventh-day Adventist church. It was strange being welcomed there. These were my own people. I felt at home and not at home at the same time. I wasn't one of them anymore, but I should have been. Australian movies are not nearly as romantic as American studio ones. They're much more realistic. The protagonist observed that the Presbyterians were better behaved than the Adventists when they came down to the big city. Adventists had this problem with fullness of response. I don't think I ever got over it. And the cannibal says to him in the bar, we were both brought up in primitive religions. That can be a comfort sometimes. So 20 years later, Ken runs into his old Adventist mates and they're drinking wine, and his mate tells him, well, now Mrs. Ellen White is supposed to be inspired by God. Well, turned out that half of what she wrote was copied off of other writers. That much couldn't have been inspired, could it? And she said it was. Lying old bitch, it's sad. The whole church is falling apart. And the protagonist observes, everyone else believes in the end of the world now. Atomic war, Nostradamus. We won, didn't we? We convinced them all that the end of the world is nigh. This is 1982. I think I can explain the protagonist's debauched behavior in this movie. He had debauched his kinesthesia. He was like this. He was all slumped and humped. Like he had this bad use of himself. He was a slave to his unconscious habits of needless tension and compression. If only he had had some Alexander technique lessons, we would then have had a much happier movie.